In this video, we're going to show you exactly how we made this beautiful table for an RV. Let's check it out. Well, first things first, we're going to use our Festool TS75 track saw to rip this slab down. And this tool really makes it easy to process a slab, to cut it in half. The track doesn't need clamps and it stays right where it needs to be during the whole cutting process. The thing is that you need to, if you're going to use a saw like this, is to take multiple shallow passes instead of trying to cut it all at one time so the saw doesn't bind when you cut through it. This first cut that I did was a little bit thick, but it totally worked out okay. This saw is awesome. I'll be doing a tool review on this saw in the next couple of videos, so stay tuned for that. This slab was pretty thick, at 2.5 inches thick. I wasn't sure if my saw was going to cut all the way through it, but I have it on top of this pallet so I can cut through without worrying about any damaging the blade at all. So you'll see this is the last pass right here where I cut all the way through the slab. It kind of binds up at the very end. There's a slight, very slight twist in the slab because of the pallet that it's sitting on. You can see it's uneven, so it's putting pressure down that last cut. But we're all good under the hood. You'll see here I'll just pass right on through it without any problems. Good to go. The cut on this saw is so good, you could it's almost jointed for glue. The next step is to take a wire wheel in your drill to get all the loose bark and stuff off the edge of the wood. The reason why you want to take off all of this loose bark is that way the epoxy has an area that it won't compromise when it soaks into the edge. So what I mean is when the epoxy soaks into the edge, you don't want it to soak into something that's going to fall off. So you want to get all that loose bark off, and that way you know that you're going to have a really good adhesion with the epoxy. So you can see here it almost looks shiny, but you want to get all that stuff off of there, all the loose stuff. The cool thing about this wire wheel is it can go over these small, looks like almost like a burl area, this little raised bump, without taking it completely off. So it leaves some of the character, but it also, you can see the grooves from where the brush strokes are, and it gives you some really good mechanical adhesion. Here we go, we got our Goodview Woodworks tape to tape up the form. If you want to know how to build a form for a river table, I'll leave a video right up here so you can click it and watch that first before you finish this video. But here we're going to skip past that. If you want to buy some Goodview Woodworks tape, you can go over to goodviewwoodworks.com and go buy yourself some tape. This tape is 3 inches wide, so it's a little wider than the normal tape, and it's a little bit cheaper as well. So we're going to use some Incredible Solutions tabletop epoxy just for the bottom thin layer, and then their liquid plastic for the second pour. So you'll see here we're just going to do a small pour on the bottom to keep the slabs from floating on top of the epoxy. So we're going to let this set up. Plus the customer didn't want to see all the way through to the bottom, but they did want it translucent. So one way you get around this is pouring a thin layer on the bottom that you can't see through, and then doing a second pour the rest of the way up to the full thickness. So it wasn't really running the way I wanted it to, so I'm just using a shower squeegee to move the epoxy around to get it all over the bottom, and that way it completely covers the tape there. we're going to take some, this is Caribbean, this color here, and then we're going to take some Maui, which is the second color, the little bit darker blue, and then finally some ocean blue for some really dark spots. Now the ocean blue almost looks like it's black, but it's actually really dark navy blue. You'll see that here in just a minute. See, it almost looks black, but it's actually dark blue. So what I'm doing here is I'm just pouring it in spots, and then I let it set. It'll flow. As long as you keep it cool and it's not too hot, it'll flow out on its own. I'll do a quick swirl, but generally speaking, I leave it like that, and it kind of flows out and does its own patterns. You see here how it kind of made its own pattern. Now what the customer wanted is to look like the bottom of the ocean, where you can see the differences in depth, so that's why we had the dark spots. Now this second pour is just a little bit of Caribbean blue mixed in with clear, and then we're going to swirl it around to get so you can see that it's translucent, so you can see to the bottom, but it's not very noticeable, the different colors. So I used some alcohol there to really pop most of the bubbles. I didn't want to use a torch too much because I didn't want it to overheat the epoxy. I wanted to take a little bit to set up. My shop was a little bit warm, so I wanted to keep the torch away from it as much as possible. So you see here, I just pop a little bit of bubbles here with the torch, and then I'm off of it with the heat source. Now if you notice the pattern there, I did not swirl that second coat of epoxy at all. As you can see, it has a really cool pattern. That is from the exothermic reaction, and this is why I didn't want to heat it up too much, because the shop is a little bit warmer than normal, and I wanted it to make the exothermic reaction, but I also didn't want it too cool to allow the pigments to settle. So it's kind of a trial and error. You'll get it if you do a bunch of these to kind of get it in the right spot to do that exotherm. But the shop was around 80 degrees when I poured. So here we just pulled the sides off. I used black silicone to keep it down. I like to use the black silicone because it just shows me if I have any holes or not, because the tape is white. It just shows me that if I have a spot that doesn't have silicone, I can easily get to it. So I'm just going to take a few little shims, have a little epoxy shims here, and I'm going to drive them under the slab to pry it up. This thing was really stuck, so I needed some help from a friend. He came by to help me lift it up, and then it just pops right up. You can see it right there. Alright, the next step is to trim off the ends. When I always make a table, I always make it a little bit longer than the finished dimension, so I can trim it to the finished dimension and make sure that it's perfectly fits where it needs to go, and it's the correct dimension. Wow, I said that a lot, sorry. So you can see the festool in action right here. You can see the blade plunge down and cut the slab. I didn't go deep enough, so we're going to do one more pass to really get it cut. And you can see how clean those edges are. It's almost like a jointer went across it. So I highly recommend this Festool TS75. Alright, let's get to sanding. That's the next step. Now, I started with 120 grit sandpaper, and I also recommend this sander here, which is the Bosch. I'll leave a link down in the description, and if you saw what I did there, I turned it on to turbo mode, and this really removes a lot of material rapidly, so that way it cuts down on sanding time. And I have noticed since I've had this sander that my sanding time has dramatically reduced, and I've almost cut my time in half from a regular DeWalt orbital sander. This is a 6-inch sander, and we are using 120 grit sandpaper. As you can see, it creates a lot of dust, so you definitely need to have some sort of respirator and or dust collection. You definitely want to stay healthy because it really makes a lot of dust. So we're going to go through the grits here. We're going to start with 120, and then we're going to go to 180, 220, and then 320 finally. You can see here, after I go to turbo mode, I switch it back to random orbit mode, and I go over the epoxy. The turbo mode, it just generates too much heat and clogs up the paper, which you'll see here in just a second. One way to get away from making little pigtails there is to continuously wipe the surface, and you can use one of these little erasers. I have a little eraser you'll see here, and it really pulls the dust off, cleans your paper up. See, I'm continuously wiping the dust. That really helps save the paper and keeps it from clogging and making those pigtails. I'm going to go over a video step by step on how to not have pigtails in your epoxy in a video coming up shortly, so stay tuned for that one. But as you can see here, when you sand epoxy, it really tends to gum the paper up pretty quickly. And as you notice, I ran out of 6-inch disc 120, and you can see that now as a 5-inch disc. So I grabbed some that I had left over, and they weren't the best disc. But now here we're going to wipe all the dust. We've actually sanded this all the way through the grits to 320, and we're wiping it with denatured alcohol to get all the dust off. We're using a different finish this time. We're using Odie's oil. This is a all-natural, food-safe finish. It's a hard wax oil similar to Rubio Monocoat, but not the same. It doesn't use a hardener, so it does take a little while to cure. It takes about a day to be able to handle, and then 2 to 3 days before you can put it to use. So you do need to let it set up for a little bit, but I really like this finish. There's no mixing. All you do is stir it up in the jar, and then you apply it. I'm using a Scotch-Brite, an old Scotch-Brite to apply it. You're supposed to use a non-abrasive one, but this one is about an 800 grit Scotch-Brite pad. So you can see here how I apply it. I really just work it into the grain. The more that you work it into the grain, the better. You know, just use a little bit of elbow grease to get your table looking nice. Look how sharp that looks. Man, that's super pretty. Alright, we're going to continue going over this entire slab. You can see how curly this walnut is. You can start to see it right on the surface where I am now. But when I get to this other side, you'll really start to see it. This is probably my favorite piece of wood to date, just because of how curly it is. And you don't, here on the East Coast, we don't really get to see curly walnut very often. You don't really use a lot of material similar to the Rubio Monocoat, as you can see on my hat there. You use just a little bit of material and you really work it into the grain. But look at how beautiful that is. You see all the curl in there? Wow. You actually use a lot less on the epoxy than you do on the wood. So we just got a little bit there. We're going to work it onto the surface. And then, as you can see, I changed from my Scotch-Brite pad to a cotton rag, like a terry cloth, and I'm going to take some more of this cotton rag and I'm put it on my sander on orbit mode, and I'm really going to buff this stuff into the surface. And just like any other hard wax oils, you really want to continue to buff it and work it into the grain until it's dry, until the rag that you're using doesn't show any more oil. Okay, so you'll see you'll keep going over it and over it until it looks dry. Okay. You can run your fingers over the surface of the table, and if it leaves any streaks, you got to keep on going, okay? So you want to keep moving and buffing until there's no finger streaks on the surface. That's what we did here. Look at how beautiful that is. So, so pretty. You see that curl, guys? Man, can that get any better? Look at that. And you can see how translucent the epoxy is. You can still see through it. but you can also see these dark patches where we got that dark blue underneath to shine through. So it only shows through just a little bit. That's why I wasn't worried about the different splotches, but man, that's beautiful. That Odie's oil really makes the grain pop, doesn't it? Trying to get every angle so you can really see that grain flip on those curls. So here the customer wanted to reuse the original bracket that held the dining table that came with the camper, and so you can see him here, he's cutting it himself so that this new table will fit. It was steel. It's a little harder than what we expected, so it took a little bit of cutting. Alright, we're going to get this thing mounted up so you guys can see it.
Nice.
It ain't perfect, it should work.
Oh, that's pretty good. Alright guys, that's it for this video. I hope that you enjoyed it, you learned something, and I'm gonna link all of the products down in the description so you can make this too. I hope you guys like that curly walnut. Isn't that awesome? The curly walnut is so pretty. Probably, I think that's my favorite wood of all time now. Curly Black Walnut. Guys, if you like it, if you have any comments, leave them down in the comment section below. You can also email me directly over at goodviewwoodworks.com. Check me out over there. I also have linked products there that you can check out. And if you need any assistance, go over there. With that being said, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one. Thanks for hanging out with us. I'm out. GoPro, stop recording.